Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Gentleman from 2019. This is a movie that was on my radar very briefly and then dropped off it completely until it was referenced recently. And I was like, oh yeah, didn't I mean to watch that? And, well, yes. The answer is yes, I did. Oh god, my brain's garbage. Anyway, this is let's just say it's a Guy Ritchie film. If you've seen Guy Ritchie's films, they have a lot of similarities, a lot of narrative through lines and cinematic design that is very similar, regardless of if you've watched the Sherlock Holmes films or his more classic stuff like Snatch and Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. And you know, I'm not going to say that I'm a big fan of his, but I find him very interesting, and I think some of his work is pretty incredible and unique for the time in which he's making movies. There are not too many filmmakers who I would say are are making really good crime comedy films, and obviously that's a kind of wide spectrum, to the point that something like well, it's funny I say that now that since I've just recently watched Bullet Train, which happens to like crack into that space in an unusual fashion. But Guy Ritchie is known for this genre. He's known in particular for British, various British location based. What am I trying to say here? He has a particularly British way of talking and showing brutality and action and all those sorts of things. And even if something like Sherlock Holmes seems very different from something like Snatch, I think in terms of his filmmaking, he's relatively consistent in terms of what he prioritizes and how he writes and how he structures his films. Structure is very important to Ritchie. He's not, I don't want to say he's a master of finesse when it comes to that, but this movie starts off with a sort of in media res kind of thing, which is very much one of his hallmarks, a sort of abrupt introduction that then hooks you but gets you interested in what led up to that moment and what goes on after that. That is very much something he does with a lot of frequency. And it's been a little while since he's made, at least to my knowledge, at least the ones I've seen, that he's made something that is more in the vein of those older films, Snatch and Lock, Stock, and a few others. Obviously, the list is a little longer. So it's interesting to see him return to this place. One of the things that I like so much about those two movies is they are extremely, extremely tight. They involve a lot of different players, a lot of different characters with different backgrounds, different motivations, some of the same things I was talking about during the Bullet Train movie. But he has a way of weaving them together so tightly that even when you have players on opposing sides, the camaraderie or the similarity or the interplay, the character-driven elements of them are so tightly woven together that even when they are people who barely know each other inside the narrative, the intimacy of the presentation and the, for want of a better word, smallness of the story really serves to highlight the intensity of emotions. Ritchie's films are very much, to my mind, about the emotionality and the things that drive people, especially in the crime world. People who are, who have either had to fight their way to get what they needed or what they wanted, who have, done things that the world looks down upon or brands as criminal in order to make a life for themselves. So obviously that is a catalyst for telling stories about people with intense emotions, high stakes, and like a lot of personal drive. And I think this movie is no exception. But I think that in trying to expand to what I can only call a more Hollywoodized version of his vision, it has lost some of the finesse that some of his earlier works did. Earlier Guy Ritchie stuff is, I hesitate to say cheap, but I don't know a better word for it. It looks inexpensive, it looks grungy, and it seems intentional. It's not just that his budgets were not that high, it's also that that is an intentional aesthetic, seemingly. I don't actually know this for sure, but it seems to be an intentional aesthetic. They use the grime to their advantage. They use intense and unpleasant framing and camera use and just awkward positioning and deliberately strange framing in order to get you a sense of that sense of intimacy again. And when you're working with a bunch of different characters who are coming from different, very, very different perspectives, but also similar, parallel-like backgrounds in these kind of, I hesitate to say crime epics, but that's really the crime epic, the likes of The Godfather and Goodfellas and those sorts of things are really where this sort of legacy, the cinematic legacy, comes from in an earlier era. Those things are. Where was I going with this? My point is that where his earlier films show those people in an intimate way, this movie gets too grand with it. It's a little bit, it's not even that the restructuring of the film, the framework that they use to present the film is incorrect. In fact, I really like it as something that he has not traditionally done. But there are a few too many players, and they are not as tightly woven. The most pointed thing I can point out without spoiling a substantial amount of the movie is this falls into a pitfall I see in a lot of other crime and mystery movies that I've talked about before, where rather than juggling all the balls right in front of your face and saying, you need to keep track of all of these, they're all right here, I'm not hiding any of them. This is the first one where I can particularly say there were elements that feel deliberately hidden, where the juggler is tossing balls off to the side, out of your vision, with the deliberate intention of not that they couldn't have kept it in front of you. They're just doing it so that they can reveal later that they've hidden something from you. And I don't like that. And I've talked about it before. It is not done so overtly or so often in this film that it becomes a serious structural problem where I'm going, why are you hiding these things from me? Why aren't you letting me get to this mystery or these connections on my own? But it is more than his previous films, and that's why I feel like it's kind of a mistake. This movie seems like it's trying to present a more a greater cinematic maturity from Ritchie, which I think is also a mistake. Guy Ritchie is, I don't know much about the person. I've heard things I don't know. He makes a few things pretty darn well. And I think when you push certain, especially writer directors, people who have the entire artistic vision more or less all to themselves. If you push them too much to do something they are not used to, I don't know how much. It's impossible to say how much actual meddling came from any given studio on this one, but especially when smaller directors get Hollywood eyes, and I have a whole laundry list of directors I can think of who fall into this problem. Some of the finesse and for in Ritchie's case, like chaos and but overt brutality gets lost in it, and this film feels more like it is trying to tell it's a Guy Ritchie idea being told through the cinematic structure of a more traditional Hollywood action crime narrative, that it is very full of itself and doesn't trust the audience to follow the narrative as closely as it should trust them, and is a little too preoccupied with some of the flourishes of the telling rather than the conciseness and the impact of the delivery. Ritchie definitely is on that like list of writer directors who produce things that are high on the violence scale without being purely violence for violence's sake. And I think that some people dislike him similarly to Tarantino because they fail to recognize the difference between violence for violence sake and violence for storytelling's sake. And this movie sort of wavers on that line more than some of his earlier works as well, in terms of being a little too stylish in order to show a willingness to do violence for style's sake rather than violence's sake, rather than the violence being purely a product of the emotions and actions, the emotions and character of the individuals involved in a scene. Again, something I talked about during the Bullet Train video. And part of me wants to go back to this one and hopes that more of understanding what the movie is hiding in that negative way reveals itself to be more for the sake of the narrative rather than the style. But I don't know. I'm going around in circles on this one a little bit because I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about it. It's been about a day since I watched it, and it hurts me because I want that Guy Ritchie of 25 years ago back, who produces things that are less Hollywood and more speak more to a specific like British crime, like grungy, brutal, and raw emotion kind of thing. And I would hate to see things continue in this vein, and for him to lose the thing that I think he's best at. Anyway, talking about the production in general, there is obviously, the point I was sort of trying to get to earlier is there's a lot more polish on this one than some of his earlier ones. That is good and bad. It is a much nicer film to look at than some of his others. And while I personally don't think that's necessarily a positive feature, it is not a negative one either. It is a much more visually approachable film that uses some more traditional, more traditional film techniques and editing techniques, and strays away from some of his less approachable visual stylings, especially the some of his more awkward framing and camera movement. I think that makes this something with greater, more broad appeal. But I do, again, just sort of miss the old grungy, weird, awkward, overly intimate thing that makes you feel uncomfortable. But it looks very nice, and it manages to still bridge the gap between having color and light and darkness. There are some very nice scenes that use lighting to really good effect. And I think there are some that the environmental lighting, because there are both indoor and outdoor scenes. Environmental lighting is also, I think, an undersung hero in this film, even more so than some of his others, in terms of setting tone and visual appeal. Naturalistic lighting is very hard to use in a way that's visually appealing, let alone meaningful to the story. And I do think that this film is in need of commendation for that in particular. In terms of his conventions and the conventions of the like modern comedy crime drama, it is more structurally typical of current time, but still has enough twists and turns that is and players that it is definitely still something I would not expect to see from most people that weren't Guy Ritchie. So in that respect, I think for all my concerns about it being Hollywoodized, it still has a lot of the hallmarks there. The cast is really excellent and deserves a shout out. The script is a little less tight and it's a little less. He tells very British stories with very British characters, and this film backs away from that a little bit more. So I'm a little disappointed that there isn't a little bit more just like over the top Britishness of various flavors. But nonetheless, I think the characters that are presented are well defined, well fleshed out, or reasonably well fleshed out, maybe not as good as before, and are played by a variety of actors who are all really excellent. All the key actors are great in this. I do want to give a particular shout out to Colin Farrell, because he plays a relatively minor character, but I just love him in everything. He's a really excellent actor, and still, despite his long and successful career, I think still relatively underrated. But everybody on the cast list is pretty excellent. I actually think, if anything, that Matthew McConaughey is maybe the weakest link here, which is especially unfortunate, or possibly because he is more or less the lead. And there are multiple American characters here, including McConaughey. So they're not trying. If McConaughey was putting on a British accent, I think we'd have a problem. But they don't do that, which is a good choice. The sound design, I think, is also something that is typically a Ritchie strong suit, and it's pretty good here, but maybe not as flashy, again, as some of his other, not as flashy or as brutal as some of his other films. Although definitely, clearly, the budget for some of the music has been improved upon, at least in terms of the amount they can spend on licensing, not necessarily the actual production of it. Yeah, there's some great like costumes and sets and locations. The actual production values of a lot of the stuff, whether it's interiors of buildings, or the things that people wear, the makeup that is on various people, both literal and practical makeup for effects, is all done pretty well. There are a few green screen and CGI things that are a little bit iffy, and a few more that are downright bad, but they are not on screen for so long as to be like particularly glaring and memorable and like laugh worthy. But it's just one of those things, you know. Wish it was a little better, or they had just omitted it. But yeah, there's some interesting stuff here, and it's definitely a decent film. But compared to Snatch or Lock, Stock, I would say it is sort of a pale imitation to his earlier works. It really depends what you're in the mood for, and I think this probably has broader appeal. So maybe this is a good introduction. If you haven't seen his work before, this is a good place to start. I think it's pretty good, despite my issues with it. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.